Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Madison Lassich. I'll be chairing this HPC application session this afternoon. Our first speaker is Dr. Sunita Kruger, who will be giving us her talk on heat transfer in greenhouses. She is a senior lecturer in the Department of Mechanical Engineering Science at the University of Johannesburg. Her research interests are natural convection, CFD, and environmental heat transfer. And she also lectures to undergraduate students in the areas of fluid dynamics and thermal systems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sunita Kruger to give her talk.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the CHPC for inviting me to give this presentation today. So I'm basically going to give you a brief overview of the research we do using the CHP, which is basically heat transfer in greenhouses. And as you know, I'm Dr. Sunita Kruger, and then my co-author is Professor Leon Pretorius from the University of Pretoria, who is also here today. Right. So briefly, just the contents. I'm going to give you an introduction, then I'll talk about the institution and our research group focus, and then the computational resources that we need to use and a bit of the research that we've done in the past few years using the CHPC, and then I'll conclude. Right, so all the students using the CHP currently are registered at the University of Johannesburg, and the University of Johannesburg is a relatively new university name-wise. It only came into existence on the 1st of January in 2005. And it's basically a merger between the old Rand Afrikaans University, the Technikon Witwatersrand, and the Soweto and East Rand campuses of Vista universities. So we've got 4 campuses, more than 50,000 students, and we have 7 faculties. Right, so we have 2 focuses in our research group. The one is on commercial greenhouses, where we basically have 3 students studying the indoor climate master students. We look at rooftop greenhouses. We have a center, part of engineering at UJ, that have greenhouses on the rooftops on buildings in the Johannesburg CBD. And we do full-scale measurements as well as the computational fluid dynamics. Then we also have students looking at reduced-scale greenhouses and they're doing wind tunnel measurements, etc. And then I've got a PhD student who recently started, and he is doing something completely different. He's looking into fluid structure interaction for the modeling of pneumatic rock drills. But I'm going to focus on greenhouses today. So just to give you a brief background, a greenhouse is basically, they have been used for centuries as a means to protect various types of plants against high winds, extreme environmental factors, airborne diseases, and insects. They are also sometimes used to assist with the efficient use of available water resources, especially in arid regions. They are used to extend the growing season of vegetables and ornamental plants, and they're also used to cultivate exotic tropical plants at higher latitudes. This slide just shows 2 commonly used greenhouses in industry. The one is the arch type greenhouse, and at the bottom we've got the Venlo type greenhouse. And you can also see the arch type greenhouse is equipped with continuous and roof and side ventilators. So the reason why we are interested in what happens inside these greenhouses is because the control of the indoor climate is of vital importance. And that is because the quality and the quantity of your crop production is directly influenced by your indoor environments, which basically is your airflow patterns, your carbon dioxide supply, the temperature, and the relative humidity. And then specifically, the convective heat exchange is what we are interested in between the crops and the interior air. That is influenced by your air movement, and that basically changes the microclimate around the vegetation. So if we can understand the microclimate, we can assist growers in optimizing fertilization and irrigation systems. Another focus is the ventilation of these greenhouses, which is quite important for horticultural production, especially in certain climates where there's excessively high temperatures. So recently also the focus has shifted from using mechanical ventilation systems to rather use natural ventilation systems because it is energy friendly, low cost, and it has low maintenance. So there's basically 2 types of natural ventilation, wind driven and buoyancy driven. Both types are influenced by your external wind speed, the direction, the temperature, and the configuration or design of the greenhouse. Right, so this is where the CHPC comes in. We use the cluster at the CHPC to run the numerical simulations using CFD software, and we're using star CCM Plus, or the it stands for computational fluid dynamics. So if you model computation, natural convection with computational fluid dynamics, it's very, very computationally intensive. So typically, just to give you an idea, a simulation can take anything from a few days to a few weeks to converge if we use a desktop computer with 8 gigs of RAM and an iCore 7 processors. That is what we had available to us up to 2017. So from 2017, we started using the resources of the CHPC. And then, of course, we started looking at 3D simulations, and that increases your cell number significantly. So our computer could no longer mesh the models. And the models that I'm specifically looking at, we use the large queue at the CHPC, so that reduces the time from a few weeks to a few days before we get conversions. And then, of course, remote visualization is also done on the server at the CHPC because our computer could no longer handle the large simulation files and do the post-processing. Right, so I'm just briefly going to go through our research. So we started off with a square cavity, which represented a square greenhouse with a flat roof, with a cold and hot wall. And we simulated the flow and the heat transfer inside. We meshed the domain with a polyhedral meshing model. It was about 55,891 cells. This is just a 2D model. And one can also see that we used the polyhedral model as well as the prism layer model to create orthogonal cells in the prism layer to account for what happens in the boundary layer. Right, so we worked with a few different Rayleigh numbers. We varied the temperature of the hot floor to create different Rayleigh numbers. And then we started looking at turbulence, and we realized that our initial simulations using the standard K epsilon turbulence model gave us poor results. So we decided to rather go with the low Reynolds number K epsilon model with a low wall Y plus treatment. But the only downside from this is that your volume mesh must be extremely fine, and so to ensure that you get the correct Y plus values on your boundaries. So it increases your mesh count considerably. So initially, we ran the simulation steady with turbulent conditions for about 1,000 iterations, and then we switched on gravity, and then we monitored convergence using probes inserted at various points in the greenhouse. Okay, so this is a bit small, but here you can basically see our comparison between the numerical and the experimental results. So the little red crosses is the CFD results using the standard K epsilon model. So you can see we didn't get good agreement there. But then we changed to the low Reynolds K epsilon model, which is the green triangles, and they basically fall exactly on the numerical results. So we got a very good correlation there. Right, so further on, we decided to change this model a bit. So first of all, we created a greenhouse with a pitched roof, and we added some roof ventilators of different sizes to see what the effect of these ventilators would be on the indoor climate of the greenhouse. We focused only on 3 Rayleigh numbers, and they corresponded to 10, 40, and 70 degrees Celsius. Right, so for this 3D model, we had about 1.5 million cells and 25 cells in the prism layer, which you can see there on the right-hand side. And we also modeled a very large control volume around the greenhouse, as you can see in the left corner, to make sure that we don't get any interference from the boundaries on what's actually happening on the inside of the greenhouse, which is the area where we're in what we are interested in. Right, so just a brief overview of the results. The surface average Nusselt plots is there at the top, and you can see that the maximum heat transfer occurs in different places for the different Rayleigh numbers. And then on the right, you can see there's a velocity plot for the different Rayleigh numbers and the opening sizes. And one can clearly see that there is some stagnant areas, and there's areas where the velocity becomes a little too high. The plot indicates the variation of the lateral average Nusselt number along the X direction that's on the floor of this greenhouse cavity. And one can see there that your highest convective heat transfer is basically if you have the largest opening on the roof. Right, then for another conference, we altered this even more and we added side ventilators. The reason for that is that experimental studies have shown that it's better to have a combination of both roof and side ventilators to ventilate a greenhouse using natural ventilation. So once again, we focused only on 3 rally numbers. We created a large mesh once again around the greenhouse, and the mesh around the greenhouse itself was refined. And this was just a 2-dimensional simulation. So we had about 67 polyhedral cells. This is just an overview of the temperature and the velocity plots. So one can see as the Rayleigh number increases, your velocity and your temperature increases as well. And there's convective cells forming, and there's some stagnant regions in the greenhouse. Right, this plot basically just shows the different Rayleigh numbers for the same side ventilator opening, and one can see the increase in velocity as your Rayleigh number increases. And you can see in the bottom corner, there's also right next to the ventilator we saw there is a stagnant area forming there. Okay, this plot just shows the comparison of the different ventilator sizes, and one can also clearly see the velocity change there. All right. Another study that we did is we thought, let's look at multi-span greenhouses. The reason for that is that they're often used in industry. And the reason for that is because the capital cost per unit covered area is reduced, as well as the heat loss per unit area during the winter. An advantage is there's less required land area required, and you need fewer construction materials if you have a multi-span greenhouse. But the air velocity and the indoor climate inside these greenhouses vary considerably, and this could influence your crop growth negatively. Right, so we modified that initial greenhouse we verified experimentally. We added a side ventilator as well as more spans to the greenhouse. And once again, just to talk about the mesh, we now went up to about 3.5 million cells. Once again, we refined the mesh around the greenhouse itself, and we activated the prism layer model, and we used the low Reynolds number K epsilon turbulence model. So that means we had to push in a lot of cells in the boundary layer. Right, so there's just some more pictures of the mesh. So for this study, we only focused on 2 Rayleigh numbers, and we looked at the temperature and velocity fields. So this is just some scalar plots. You can see the temperature increases towards the one side of the greenhouse where there's no ventilator. And it's definitely hotter in the third span. And if you look at the bottom plot, you can see there's a lot of convective cells forming in this multi-span greenhouse. This basically just summarizes the temperature, velocity, and Nusselt number plots. So if you look at the Nusselt number, which indicates our convective heat transfer, one can see that for the 3-span greenhouse, which is the orange line, you've got a bit of an increase in the convective heat transfer close to the side vent, and then it stays relatively constant throughout the rest of the greenhouse. The temperature distribution is also completely different, and it increases from left to right, but you can see that the temperature in the multi-span greenhouse is much lower compared to that in the single-span greenhouse. Right, so this is just for the higher Reynolds number. Same story, we've got an increase in temperature and a lot of convective cell forming in there. And here we've just plotted the temperature and velocity distribution. So it's quite heterogeneous inside, especially for the 3-span greenhouse. Right, and this is just the Nusselt number distribution, in other words, the heat transfer that we're interested in. So one can see that the heat transfer for the 3-span greenhouse is the highest close to the vent, and it basically tapers down towards the closed side of the greenhouse. Right, so in conclusion, we've investigated various design aspects numerically using the CHPC. And this CFD assisted us to obtain relatively simple Nusselt-Rayleigh relationships for the complex domains. The CHPC also assisted in creating general flow and temperature distributions in complex greenhouse domains, and this is, of course, beneficial for improved crop growth. The post-processing, creating the plots and streamlines, were also done using the visualization server at the CHPC. And overall, the results from these studies indicate that care should be taken when designing greenhouses and where the plants are placed inside these greenhouses. If you, for example, expand the greenhouses to contain more spans and adding side ventilators, the indoor climate can vary significantly throughout the greenhouse. Right, so for future research, we will include the interaction of multiple greenhouses in a commercial farming operation, and this, of course, will require increased computational power as can be found at the CHPC. Thank you.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. Do we have any questions from the audience? Your microphone is coming.
Yep. You're going to try it with an eddy resolving turbulence model?
We haven't done that yet, but we have thought of maybe looking at different turbulent models and see what the effect are.
But specifically like a detached eddy simulation kind of thing.
Yeah, we'll probably have a look at it
Okay.
in future soon. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my question is sort of similar, although the LES is another kind of, it's not a RANS approach, it's a bit more computationally expensive approach. But I was wondering, how did you came about using the standard K epsilon rather than for example, maybe like a K mega SST or like a, so how did you came about using that specific turbulence model from literature or?
Yeah, basically from literature, quite a bit of research has been done where they did experimental work and they modeled the greenhouse using computational fluid dynamics, and they usually just went with the K epsilon model. There are some articles which specifically state that K epsilon seems to be the most suitable. But yeah, that doesn't mean it's cast in stone. So there's definitely area for investigation.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thank you. Just as an explanation, maybe in addition to what Sunita said with the turbulence models, if you look into history in the from 80s onwards, natural convection was one of the most researched, the square. It was one of the most researched items. And K epsilon, in the beginning, only laminar cases were checked. And the big problem was when it became unstable, nobody knew how to try and figure out the initial ones. And they started in the beginning to sort of just blend and keep the instabilities off. And then the K epsilon became popular in those days. I mean, in the beginning, obviously there was, but then what was very interesting, because in those days, when this studies even started in the early 2000s with Sunita, we did not really have the large eddy simulations and the RANS possibilities available. So we tried to figure out from K epsilon to this one that gave us the obvious jump from rather inaccurate results in terms of Nusselt-Rayleigh relationships to the low K epsilon. But one of the biggest tricks in all of this that I've seen Sunita suffer is to get this thing to try and converge. And one of the tricks that she figured out was the gravitation, just to get it sort of set out and then put the gravitation on in a gradual fashion, not directly, ramp it in until it was relatively stable, and then in that way got some form of stabilized solution. So it was quite a long journey for her to just get something sensible in the beginning.
If we don't have any other questions, join me in thanking Sunita for her wonderful talk. And here is a